Critics Podcast.
Armchair Critics Podcast.
Members of the notorious Armchair Critics Podcast have been arrested for having too many opinions.
Armchair Critics Podcast!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of the Armchair Critics Podcast. I'm your host, Aidan Howe.
And I'm your host, Ethan Engert.
And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing Joel and Ethan Coen's 2013 drama film, Inside Llewyn Davis. I love this movie. This is the third time I've seen it. And since we're both Coen's fans and Ethan hadn't seen it yet, I figured it was the best choice to select for this week's episode. Mm-hmm. So let me start out by asking, Ethan, what did you think of Inside Llewyn Davis?
All right, I have written down, Inside Llewyn Davis is like Oh Brother Where Art Thou's evil twin. While not devoid of levity, this is possibly the bleakest film in the Coen brothers' filmography. This slight departure from their MO still brandishes noticeable Coenisms, making it a refreshing addition to a list of films I love. But what really makes this film sing is the message it gives us. Watching Llewyn's sad life fall apart wouldn't be nearly as enjoyable without such strong themes. Right off the bat, we say this just about every episode, but especially the ones that are shot by Roger Deakins, the lighting here is unbelievable. And I would say the best in any film we've seen so far, which is something that I thought really helped with this film, which gets to a bigger point of the bleakness, which I was very surprised by. But this kind of like almost black and white lighting, very stark, not only was gorgeous, but helped the tone of the film develop, which I said I was surprised by. Usually the Coens are pretty comedic directors, even in their darker pieces, and often have straight-up comedies. And as I said, there were definitely some very, very funny bits in this film. But it was super cool to see them take a different turn. And I think they did it very well. There was not a moment, if you asked me, that I would have doubted if they could handle it. And this is assuredly one of their best modern triumphs. But Aidan, I want to hear. You love this film. Tell me why.
I do love this movie. In fact, after this watch, I think this may even be my favorite Coen's film. I think it might knock Cold Man out of the way.
Oh my gosh, this heresy.
All right, so let me explain my reasoning. Inside Llewyn Davis, similar to The Big Lebowski, is a film that doesn't initially appear to be tightly scripted, but it is. And there are just these brilliant little touches throughout the entirety of the script that make me think the Coens have it fully under control. It's, it seems not very Coenish in some ways. As you mentioned, in other ways, it's very Coenish. Mm-hmm. It takes a few of their tendencies to its extreme. So, like, the Coens like to sort of marry realism and surrealism in the same movies.
Yeah.
And this movie has some of the most realistic realism and some of the most surrealistic surrealism in their entire filmography. It is incredibly funny at times. It is incredibly dark at other times. Yeah. And the entire movie just has this interesting feel, like something supernatural is going on in a way. I think it's almost like a purgatory for the main character in a way. Maybe purgatory, maybe him purging himself of his sins, but also maybe just him making the same mistakes and repeating over and over again. Because, one of the most interesting things about the film is that it's in Ouroboros, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, where he starts and ends in literally the exact same place.
Yeah.
Just with a few minor changes. And he ends the movie literally getting the crap kicked out of him by a stranger because he shot his mouth off.
Yeah.
Llewyn is one of the most interesting film protagonists I've ever seen, and easily one of the best characters the Coens have ever created. He's animated by an unbelievably good performance from Oscar Isaac.
Yes.
And he the first half of the movie is spent establishing him as a bad person and someone who's horrible to those around them. And the second half is spent making you feel sympathetic towards him and realize that, in a way, the mess that his life is in is largely due to his bad decisions, but it's also just due to bad luck. And until by the end, you're just like groaning at every new stroke of bad luck that just comes and slaps him in the face, and at the very, very end, literally to the point where he is just lying bleeding on the ground with just like nothing left for him. I'm going to get into spoilers. This is a spoiler discussion. Please watch Inside Llewyn Davis. It's not a super plot heavy movie, but it does have plot. The ending, I think, is phenomenal, partly because of the historical context. So this takes place in Greenwich Village in the 1960s. It's sort of this folk music scene where folk really got popular, and you had all these up and coming young kind of hippie artists, including Llewyn Davis, who is based partially on a real person. I can't remember his name, unfortunately. It was Don something, I believe. And the only real notable artist who we remember today to come out of that time and place was Bob Dylan. And yes, and at the very end of the movie, when Llewyn goes outside to talk to this guy, Bob Dylan gets on the stage and he starts playing. And
yes!
In a way,
so cool.
It was so cool. And the first time I watched it, I was like, "Oh, hey, that's Bob Dylan. That's cool." It feels a little weird to kind of ground the movie this much in history when the rest of it just feels sort of surreal. But I'm vibing with it. But on this watch, I kind of realized this is kind of the ultimate phase of Llewyn's character arc, and it's sort of like the universe mocking him at the very end, because it's the only successful artist to make it out of this entire generation and group of hopeful young artists. The only one to actually make it is playing music as our main character, who has similar hopes and similar dreams, and I'd even argue similar talent, is literally getting the tar beat out of him. It's just amazing. The entire movie is like, it's kind of about the struggles of being an artist, I guess, in more ways than one. And again, that itself is simultaneously scornful towards and sympathetic towards our main character. He's a suburban white kid who wants to play folk music, Folk music that he has no personal or spiritual connection to. He just thinks it sounds cool and is like, oh, well, I'm an artist now. People should take me seriously. And that is most demonstrated by the scene where the woman from Arkansas gets up and she starts singing folk songs, which she actually grew up with. And he starts belittling her. He does not like it, and he starts screaming, I hate folk music, I hate folk music. Obviously, he's at a low point at that point, but I think he's almost showing what he really thinks, which is he's basically chosen a path for himself that he has no reason to choose, and he can't maintain it.
Right.
He doesn't have enough experience in real life. He's not a wise enough person. He's not a perceptive enough person to really create lasting art in the way that he wants to.
Right.
He has talent, obviously. He's very, very good. But he just doesn't have that special something. And the couple of times, I'd say there are two performances in this movie where he really, really pours his heart and soul into the song. And one of those is in front of Bud Grossman, and the other is in front of his father. And neither of them does anything. And you can just see him die inside after he finishes both of those songs. And he realizes that his art, which he's sacrificed everything for, has no effect on the world. We've seen all of these movies about the American dream, where you can have like a nobody who starts at the bottom and makes their way to the top just through sheer grit and determination and talent. And Llewyn has talent, and he has some grit and some determination. He's not a complete loser. He's trying to figure out, what the next step in his career is, but he doesn't make it. So instead of the American dream, we're getting the American reality in this movie.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so that's a whole lot of stuff at once. I just wanted to throw out a bunch of vaguely connected random thoughts.
Yeah. The Coen brothers are my favorite directors. And that is partially because if if I were omniscient, but still had like my own, subjective values, I would make my films exactly like the Coen brothers. I just agree with everything they do. One thing that I love, probably more than anything else, is their emphasis on theme. I really enjoy that. And it's a little different in their films than usual. I used the word message earlier, and it kind of did feel like a message, because often their films feel like they're speaking to you. At the end of No Country for Old Men, it's a very personal moment, and it feels like almost this call to arms, kind of like, all right, Sheriff Ed Tom Bell really does not know what the theme of this film was. Do you? Are you going to do something about it? And that was kind of how it felt here. Like, almost like, I'll bring up another film, Fight Club. Fight Club is like, there's a problem, here's a solution. It's not the right one. Figure out what the right solution is. And I kind of feel like that was what was going on here. On some level, there are these kind of ideas of, you were talking about Llewyn working hard and putting his soul into it, but it was just kind of something, I don't know, you might say it's not for him, and he's too stubborn to admit it. In fact, he is so stubborn that he will belittle others who are at least as good as him to try and make himself feel better. And I almost feel like that kind of betrays some self-awareness, and why I would use the word stubborn, not ignorant. And it's very interesting. I can't say after one watch how that all fits together, but it's definitely something to think on, and it is, something that I've been thinking on, something that I've been, that's a great sign of a great film, something that makes you reflect on your life. And this is, specifically as a collegian, this is something that really affected me, kind of to be more aware of your trajectory in life. And unlike Llewyn was, I thought that was a very great strong suit of this film, and possibly the point of it all. He goes on this epic journey. I said it was like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. He even comes across this poster of what's the name of that film where all the pets like run away from home and they travel like 200 miles, the poster says, and then they come back. It's crazy. I don't remember, but
The Incredible Journey.
Yes, that's the one. And he goes on an incredible journey, and each step feels like this old Arthurian legend, or like the Odyssey, like Oh Brother, where it has this thematic significance. He encounters different characters that represent different things that he's supposed to overcome and doesn't. But it's more than just failing. This is not a story about succeeding and failing. It's not that black and white. He kind of makes this conscious decision. And so I'd say, in the end, it is not 100% tragic. He has chosen a life for himself, and he has chosen a life that he does not want to have. He points out that his father just existed, and we do get to see where that got him, just soiling his pants in an old person's home, and it's very cool to see this very nuanced narrative, which is something that the Coen brothers have always been spectacular at.
So interesting. Yeah. He your point about him being aware of his own shortcomings is interesting. I do think that's true. He's inconsistent, and that's shown through how he describes what he does throughout the movie. And he is aware of it. He just kind of throws words out as a defense mechanism against people. So like when he's debating with Jean in the restaurant, and they're talking about how she and Jim want to kind of make enough money to settle down and raise a family, then he kind of scoffs and he goes, well, that's pretty square. That's pretty careerist of you.
Yeah.
But then in the scene where he's with the Gorfines, and he's at their place, and he starts playing music, and Mrs. Gorfine starts singing Mike's part. He freaks out, and he goes, "This is my job, all right? This is not a party trick. This is how I pay the rent." Mm-hmm. Ironic, of course, because he is currently homeless. There's this sense that is growing on him as the movie goes on that he has made a horrible, horrible choice, and there's no going back. And that's it. There's no going back. That's the worst part for him, because he can't even get back into the Merchant Marine.
Yeah.
He doesn't have enough money to literally go back into the military, which was his absolute last resort. There's nothing he can do. He's trapped by this grim cocktail of bad decisions and bad luck. So, even if he was the worst person in the world, we would still have sympathy for him just because of how paralyzed he is. Just because he has nothing left to turn to. And the Coens certainly do. He's by far one of their most sympathetic protagonists. He's very interesting in that regard. He debates with people throughout the movie. I think a big part of the problem is he views himself as an artist, and therefore he thinks he has the right to just disrespect people. Right. And that doesn't get him anywhere, including in areas that he wants it to. So like when he's talking to Bud Grossman after his performance, and he brings up Troy, Bud Grossman kind of grins at it and goes, "Oh, Troy? He's a good kid. He connects with people." And that's the issue, is that Llewyn can't connect with people. He only connects with his art. And art is based off people. For better or worse, except in a few art forms, most of the time you have to understand people and you have to look around you if you're going to create good art. You can't just get wrapped up in your tiny fictional world and just hope for it to turn out well. Pure escapism doesn't work if you want to create something that's lasting and something that's important. And that's what Llewyn sort of slowly, miserably discovers as the movie goes on.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that. We both know film, and we can look at directors who love films, and those are the directors who are great. The directors who respect each other, and I think not long ago of Paul Thomas Anderson going to see Venom Let There Be Carnage and talking about how much he enjoyed it. That's very that's a pretty mature thing to say. That's a pretty wise thing to say, to not just admit that it was a bad movie and say I didn't enjoy it for that reason. To say I still respect something that's entertaining, and that is something that Llewyn cannot do. Mm-hmm. And one of his bigger shortcomings, it's cool to see this kind of like I was saying, it's a very complex narrative. It's a very complex message, and so this is another aspect of him. There's multiple reasons why he's in the position he is. And one of them is that he is very egotistic and lives in his own world. It's like this, form of escapism, like you were saying. And he makes it whatever he wants to be. You brought up something that, helped me realize he does kind of change when he interacts with different people, like you were saying about, he was saying, that's careerist, and then saying, this is my career. He's very, you can't nail him down. He can't nail himself down. And he kind of just has an excuse for everything so that he can always be right. He can always be number one in his book. But the thing is, it's not his book that matters. And I think that is another one of the, kind of messages that the Coens are trying to get across. This film reminded me of an episode of SpongeBob. And Llewyn Davis is Squidward, where Squidward is not the most sympathetic character, but all of this terrible stuff always happens to him, and you always feel bad for him. And I feel like that's kind of where Llewyn Davis is, and there's something about that where you can see this person who is struggling, and it's not just because there's a little bit of it that isn't his fault. He latches onto that, and because you see this character struggling, you sympathize with them more, and it kind of makes you care more about the themes because you are more sympathetic for this character, and you say, well, I don't want to be that guy.
Absolutely. Llewyn is Squidward. Noted.
I didn't really know where else to put that, but I was thinking of that throughout the entire film, and I couldn't not mention it.
No, it's an interesting point. I like that. I like it. Yeah, he's incredibly egocentric. That's a big part of his character, and that's one of the things that made me really like it this watch around. Was like in the first half especially, I could just see all these little ways where it comes out. Like the scene where Mel's assistant is like getting a box full of records from the closet, and she's clearly struggling with it. This is like a super old woman, and he like just leans against the desk with his arms crossed and doesn't offer to help. Yeah. Or, the fact that he never says thank you when he's like given food or whatever. Just little things like that. He's self-absorbed, and that's his main issue. And that partially lends the movie its surrealist tone because it's very subjective. It's objective enough that we can see this guy's clearly a terrible person. He's a flawed protagonist, but he almost acts like a narrator. He's not actually a narrator, but he almost acts like a narrator in that we just see literally everything through his eyes. In the bizarre night scenes, the driving scenes, it's very impressionistic. Yeah. And that's the scenes where we sort of get the closest to Llewyn's soul, to what he's thinking the most, and it's like literally the dark night of the soul, You see when he's like almost asleep and just strange things start happening. You see his own past coming back to haunt him. Those are some of the most interesting scenes in the movie, I think. And I'd like to get into those a little. Okay. There's the whole thing with Roland Turner and Johnny Five, which starts out hilarious because Roland Turner is a hilarious character. And then sort of turns tragic as you learn that he's a heroin addict. He is possibly dead by the end of the time we see him. And Johnny Five, who seems like a pretty similar character to Llewyn in many ways, is arrested. Johnny Five, I think, is interesting because he's another artist character. He starts reading some of his poetry while they're in the cafe, and he's just sort of this lonely soul kind of wandering through the universe and wondering how he got there. His art sucks, I will say.
Yeah.
His poetry is not good, but he's sort of a similar person to Llewyn. And then, Llewyn makes the selfish decision to leave this random cat that he picked up in the car with Roland, and he just kind of abandons them both to their fate. A, an innocent cat, and B, a man who is possibly dead or near dead from a heroin overdose. Yeah. He just leaves him be. And then, as he hitchhikes with this other guy and keeps driving, he hits a cat. That's one of the oddest and creepiest moments in the movie. It feels like something out of an old folktale, out of a fable maybe. And you can see just sort of terror on his face that you don't see anywhere else as he starts to wonder what's happening to him. As he starts to wonder if maybe he is sort of trapped in his own little hell. That is brought out in two other things I noted. That sort of supernatural side to it. One is Roland Turner's entire monologue about black magic, The whole part about, you may wake up and wonder, why is your life such a mess? And it'll be me. I don't think Roland Turner is responsible for Llewyn's life being a mess. But, his life is a mess. And it seems like Llewyn is close to cursing God or someone for the fate that's been brought upon him.
Right.
And one more final little surrealist touch that I thought was kind of funny was there is this man wearing a coat and glasses and a fedora who appears staring on the subway at Llewyn, not once but twice. Once when the subway is crowded with people, and once when it's just him and Llewyn. And then he shows up again later in the movie, just looking at Llewyn as he's outside the movie theater staring at the Incredible Journey poster. So that's just another great little touch that makes me wonder, how much of this is even real? For all we know, Llewyn's super old, or he's in an asylum or something, and he's just reliving the same few days over and over in his head, just kind of mixed up together. I don't think that's necessarily fully the case, and I really appreciate the Coens didn't directly put that in the narrative. But
They
it
never
does.
do.
Yeah, they never do. But it does sort of seem like that could be the case, and you could even make that argument for a lot of their movies.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing that I really respect about them is how kind of subjective their films are.
Yeah.
Which is really paired well with their kind of personal messages almost speaking to you, if you can draw out a theme, and better yet, if that theme is incredibly relevant to you specifically, that is quite the accomplishment on the part of the artists.
Mm-hmm.
But man, that road trip sequence was very fun. Possibly my favorite section of the film. The John Goodman character was so entertaining. He, not only because he was cast as John Goodman, but that scene was just like, this is a character in a Coen Brothers film. Because he was a very funny addition to the movie, but he brought this extra layer to it. There's this kind of struggle with Llewyn and these record companies where they just aren't selling his stuff the way that it is. And the guy in Chicago who he actually does meet with suggests, he says, just be a backup singer. You are not good enough to be a lead. Which would be Llewyn having to sacrifice kind of the life he's already decided he's going to live no matter what. And he says no. But you mentioned that what's his name? Jimmy Five?
Johnny Five, I believe.
Johnny Five. He's very almost kind of like another universe version of Llewyn Davis, as well as not just because he's similar, but because he's kind of like Llewyn Davis if he did listen to those record labels and said, basically, I'll submit myself, because he has this John Goodman character just looming over him constantly, just like eating up all the airspace and just like, this is my valet. That's what he's reduced to. And it's interesting to see, you can't really say which is better. Llewyn doesn't want that, but Llewyn also probably, I would assume, doesn't want a life where he is homeless and getting no music or getting no opportunities to make music. I think that's very cool that the Coens in this film, again, didn't make it very black and white. It's like, major spoilers. I'm going to spoil Shutter Island right now. But like at the very end, Leonardo DiCaprio's character is presented throughout the whole film. You realize it's kind of this test for him to see, can he accept his past and is he sane? And at the end, it's he only chooses one. He says, I am sane. I know what I did. I know that I'm a monster, but I'm going to choose. I still cannot accept that. And it seems tragic, because this whole, you wouldn't want him to be lobotomized. But it is his choice. He decides, I would rather turn into a zombie than live with this, terrible memory. And you kind of see that with Llewyn. I don't think this is all tragic, as bleak as it is, and as it's certainly not a happy ending, but he chooses the life that he wants. And I want to talk about the ending real quick. I thought that was so incredibly strong. The way that, last week I was talking about Prisoners made me think of that Nietzsche quote, time is a flat circle. And this is even more explicitly so. And so he chooses this life of repetition. You get to see it. You get to see that his life gets him nowhere. Other people around him are progressing. You can see just many, many ways that he has the opportunity to pull himself out of this life. But that is the life he has chosen. And he decides, this is what I want. I would rather live, penniless than in a field that I don't love.
Yeah. He's the quintessential self-destructive Coen's protagonist in some ways.
Yeah.
It is interesting also to look at this in the context of Coen's characters by and large, because every Coen protagonist, I would say, really fits their movie, and you can sort of, each movie is almost just getting to know this protagonist and then seeing the world through their eyes,
Yeah.
So like The Big Lebowski is a quirky and laid back and bizarrely paced movie because the dude is a slacker who is constantly high. Raising Arizona is fast paced and cartoony and optimistic because Hi McDonough is a fairly stupid but very good natured guy, ex-bank robber from Arizona. Inside Llewyn Davis is slow paced and depressing and ultimately kind of beautiful, albeit very self-absorbed, because that's how our protagonist sees the world. He sees it about him. The movie is about him. It's literally called Inside Llewyn Davis, and you can sort of see that in that he titled his album Inside Llewyn Davis.
Right.
He's saying it has to be about him. But at the same time, there's sort of this just cold beauty that you can see in the world from his perspective. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I would like to touch on is the dialogue in this film. The Coen brothers have always been hailed for the dialogue. I've always hailed them for the dialogue. And it comes through here. It is so snappy and witty and smart. But what I also love about the Coen brothers is what they can do without dialogue. And I'd love to talk about both. And I think of two separate scenes with Gene. The first one is when Llewyn is at the Gaslight Cafe, and he's watching. Jean is on stage, and at first it's just this scene of him being passed over, as well as showing his egotism, expecting that this guy who he has never met in his life, earlier than today, is going to bring him onto stage and say, hey, why don't you do a number with me? But it progresses into something else when the camera starts to push on Llewyn Davis and reverse shot, the camera starts to push on Jean. And earlier, you remember, she tells him that she's pregnant, and this is a moment, as well as other directorial touches, but in this moment, you kind of come to the realization that this child is probably Llewyn's.
Yeah.
And I was so impressed with that. That was so cool. The way it wasn't even explicitly said, but certainly not through dialogue, that the Coen brothers were able to get a point across. And this is, I've read many essays about how the Coens respect their audience's intelligence, and I felt respected. I felt so smart. As if this is something that I came up with on my own. But it's really because the Coens are so good at giving you information. But then later, after that scene, it is the dialogue between Jane and Llewyn, in which she does explicitly say, this kid could be yours. I have no idea. And it makes me think of, I brought up that one Roger Ebert review not long ago, where the Coens kind of understand what they can do with cinema and what their limitations are. And, in literature, you can very explicitly as well as eloquently get points across, whereas, in cinema you can do it in a more evocative way. And the Coens lean into both. They have that scene where you have this revelation and you kind of get the emotional side of it. You understand what it means for these two characters to be in such a sticky situation. But then you get the more cerebral but elegant kind of the verbal explanation of what's happening and kind of the explicit breakdown of what's going on in a way that is not hammered over your head, which is something I really love about the Coens. They are able to say a lot with a little, and vice versa. They are able to have very drawn out scenes of just fun dialogue that's enjoyable to watch.
Absolutely.
Listen to, rather.
Your point about saying a lot with a little, I think, does very much apply to this movie. It's a fairly minimalist script in some ways. There are plenty... I'd honestly say this movie is almost 50-50 scenes with dialogue and scenes without dialogue. There's just a lot of shots of Llewyn, walking from one location to another, or just like hanging out and smoking, or just thinking, Right. And then at the same time, you've got sort of blustery characters like Roland Turner, who say a lot without saying almost anything at all.
Right.
And that's an interesting dichotomy that comes up a lot throughout the Coen's filmography, is talking a lot versus talking a little. I like the dialogue in this movie a lot. I think it's again an interesting balance between realistic and unrealistic. Every character's personalities feel well developed in the way that they describe their goals and the way they carry themselves and stuff. One of the quotes that I just really liked was Jean berating Llewyn, and she goes, "Do you ever think about the future?" And he kind of deflects by going, "What, the future? You mean like flying cars? Like hotels on the moon?"
Mm-hmm.
This is another good example of him not committing to anything. He basically annoys her into giving up her line of questioning. And every single character is like that.
Yeah. That makes me think of two things. One of which is Llewyn's. We talked about his stubbornness, but also his defensiveness. There is that one scene where he is driving. Well, actually, I should set this up first. As he's going to the doctor who's gonna handle Jane's abortion, he finds out that there was another time that he came to this doctor with a girl who he thought had an abortion but didn't, and so he has a kid out there somewhere living in Akron. He finds out. Then later in the film, the only other time this is mentioned, he's driving to New York, and he passes a sign for an exit to Akron, and you can see him thinking about it, but he doesn't actually go there, and that's it. Like, it's very heavily implied. I believe he will never ever meet that kid, and it's a great example of his stubbornness and his defensiveness, where he would be such a different person with a kid in his life who he would have to care for, and I think he knows that. And he just decides, I'm not going to have that responsibility at all. I'm going to focus on myself and his egotism. And he just decides, I'm going back home. I'm going back to what I know. What I know is not going to work out, but it's what I've known and what I've decided.
It would force Peter Pan to grow up, basically.
Right.
Wife and child is what forces guys like this to grow up, and he refuses that and ends up in the exact same place. Your point earlier about relating to this as a collegiate, I think, really holds true. The second time that I saw this, I got some extra money for, I believe, Christmas, so I used it to buy the Criterion Blu-ray of this movie, which is a great purchase. And I was just watching it in my room by myself, and Llewyn's just kind of bouncing around between people's homes and eating their food. I thought, much more than the first time I watched this when I was in high school, I can relate to this, And sort of that uneasy feeling of just constantly trespassing on people's hospitality and of not giving anything back in return. The, on a related note, that scene where he thinks about going to see his kid but decides not to is a very interesting one to think about. One of the features in the Blu-ray was this pretty interesting 40-minute long interview, which I think I had time to watch most of, between Guillermo del Toro and the Coens about it's fantastic. Yeah. People at home, please go watch it. It's interesting about their filmography in general and inside Llewyn Davis in particular. And Ethan Coen starts saying, we put that scene in. The movie is 100% about Llewyn and his character arc, and we didn't even attempt to think about what him visiting Akron would be like because it just wouldn't make sense. They didn't put any even idle thought into thinking about what Diane or what his kid would be like, because it just wouldn't make sense for Llewyn as a character. Because he's trapped within his own decisions. He doesn't change anything. He just keeps going in this vicious cycle. And I think pretty much the only change that we can see in the entire movie from him at the beginning and at the end is that as he's leaving the Gorfines apartment for the second time, he kicks the cat out of the way and makes sure it doesn't get out of the door with him.
Right.
That's it. And that's just him changing a tiny little bit by absolute necessity. He refuses to move on.
Yeah. I was thinking of that title, Inside Llewyn Davis. You're making me think a little bit about it, and I think it's a spectacular name for a fictional record. It made me think while I was watching. I believe it is the Beatles' sophomore album titled "With the Beatles," where they, after "Please Please Me," they immediately become sensational, Beatles mania, and they kind of bill themselves, like, buy a record, you're going to be with the Beatles, and what teenage girl in the 60s wouldn't want that? And it's kind of like, of course, that record came out in 1963 after this, but it's kind of like Llewyn Davis's same philosophy, where he's like, oh, hey, you guys want to experience inside Llewyn Davis? Wouldn't you like to get to know me better? And nobody says yes. As well as it is a very fitting title for a film about him. You're going to see inside Llewyn Davis. But one more thing that you were making me think about, and I don't know if this is true. I don't know how valid this is if it's not. But I was thinking, it's interesting you're saying he's trapped. He's kind of trapped inside Llewyn Davis, kind of this character who he has created himself. And like I keep saying, he decided this is who he's going to be, and he's too stubborn to change it. And he's kind of trapped inside Llewyn Davis, this version of himself that he has created. I don't know. What do you think of that?
That's a fantastic point. He's created this persona and he won't retreat from it. And you can see that in some other characters too. For example, Al Cody, whose real name is Albert something. And he goes, oh yeah, I'm going to have it changed legally. But, Llewyn, he hides behind this facade. And I think some of the most interesting scenes that reflect that are the two scenes that he has with his sister. He starts kind of ranting about the entertainment business. She sort of reminds him of his human side in ways that he dislikes. He doesn't like being around her because she reminds him of his childhood and stuff. So she pulls out this recording that he made, which is the song that he recorded for his parents when he was 8. And, he looks at this recording that he put so much passion into, and it's this reminder of his early life, and he goes, oh, yeah, in the entertainment business, it's considered bad policy to release your early stuff. Kind of ruins the mystique.
Right.
He's trying to cultivate mystique. And, his sister's sarcastic response is, oh, well, I wouldn't know much about the entertainment business. But she recognizes that he has propped up this facade for himself and that it's desperately failing, and that he's like the little Dutch kid with his finger in the dike,
Right.
It's like, even if he has cultivated mystique among anyone, which I don't think he has, maybe a few people who have bought his album without knowing him, that is crashing down around him, and he's put his entire life into it, and there's nothing surrounding it. The scene with Bud Grossman, I think, is still one of the most pivotal scenes in that regard, where it's such a great little performance from F. Murray Abraham, who just kind of shows up in this movie, and even just the sarcastic way he says, blame me something from inside Llewyn Davis. Just shows his condescension towards him, because he's seen people like Llewyn before. He's seen guys who have put away everything important and devoted themselves to a persona that they create. And the only person that he speaks favorably of in the 5 or 10 minutes that he's in the movie is Troy, because he connects with people and because he's authentic. And you could make the same argument about Bob Dylan, who is... I haven't read a whole lot about Bob Dylan, but from what I've seen in a few interviews and stuff that I've watched, he seems like a legitimately thoughtful guy, a guy who cares about things and who works that into his music. Unlike Llewyn, who just goes, all right, I'm going to be an artist and make good music, and just tries to roll from there.
Yeah. Yeah, what Bruce Springsteen was to the 80s, Bob Dylan was to the 60s. He was a man's man connecting with the middle class. And that is just something Llewyn does covers, Yeah. That's a very interesting portion of the film where he's in Chicago with Grossman. And there is definitely this, maybe not a theme, but a concept in here, we touched on it a little bit, of kind of having to sell yourself to a record label. I mean, that was a real thing. If you watch basically any biopic on music or know anything about Led Zeppelin or Prince, Atlantic Records sucks, but they were the big guys, and they were like the Disney or Warner Bros. Of the music industry.
Yeah.
And Grossman gives Llewyn the advice. I said, maybe be a backup or something. But he also gives him this advice to shave so he just has a goatee and stay out of the sun a bit. So he kind of creates this more, what Grossman believes would be a more connectable image. And it's kind of like this sad expression of what often sells. Actually, his response to Llewyn after listening to his music is not, that was okay, or that was bad music, or I just didn't even like it. It was just, I don't see a lot of money in this,
Yeah.
And that's just where his head is. He doesn't seem like a guy who was affected by the music at all, as you could see some characters were. If you told me that Grossman doesn't know a thing about music and doesn't care, like the people at Atlantic did, I would believe you, And that's just like kind of another thing, another scapegoat for Llewyn, but also the truth that these people try and sell an image rather than music.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that being so concrete and easy to see is a very interesting thing to throw into this mix of the tragedy of Llewyn's life. I think it brings a lot to the script, that it is very nuanced, the reason that he's there. The Coens write a lot about random chance affecting life, for better and for worse. That is a central theme in No Country that wasn't so much so in the novel, something that they created for that. But never in their films do they presume that random chance is insurmountable, given to the fact that, Anton Chigurh, who is practically an agent of chaos, is subjected to chaos himself. It's not something you can control, yet still, at the end of the film, Sheriff Aidan Bell does have the opportunity. He doesn't take it, but he has the opportunity to triumph over chaos. And so does Llewyn. And just like Sheriff Aidan Bell, he does not take it.
They both give up.
Yeah. It's like they don't know that they're in movies. Obviously, they don't. But it's like if they were watching the film, they would just be like, this is a tragedy through and through. But it's a tragedy because they decide it's a tragedy.
The average movie protagonist, it would, when faced with a situation of, insurmountable odds, would be like, well, there's still a chance I'll triumph. I have to go on,
Right.
If No Country for Old Men was not written by the Coens, or Cormac McCarthy, I guess, Sheriff Aidan Bell probably would have been like, oh, well, Anton Chigurh is this seemingly unstoppable force, and it's so depressing, but I gotta power through. I gotta triumph for good, and then, end the movie victoriously arresting him. Or Llewyn Davis would go, hey, well, Grossman hates my work, but that's okay. I'll find someone else and work harder and turn myself into the best musician I can be, and then,
Right.
end up the next Bob Dylan or whatever. The Coens make movies about losers, and they're not just losers because life keeps wailing on them. They're losers because they believe they are losers.
Yes.
Nearly every Coen protagonist, the only one I can actively think of who doesn't fit into this somehow is maybe the dude. Every Coen protagonist believes they are a loser and believes that they will fail, and they hate themselves in some way because of that. Some of them are able to grow beyond that. Some of them aren't. And Llewyn Davis is one of the ones who is not able to grow beyond that. He's simultaneously egocentric and self-hating.
Yeah, I think that bit is pretty nuanced. To the point that just about anybody could have any read of that, final, how triumphant Llewyn is. No, that's not true. I think I do know where I fall. I've seen some pieces writing about how there's this big theme of depression in Llewyn, and how Llewyn kind of conquers that, and I can definitely see that. I don't know if I believe it as strongly as they do, but I can't deny it. And I think there is something to be said of Llewyn not being victorious, but still trudging on. Man, it's so interesting, and the more that I think about it, the more that we talk about it, the more I love this kind of theme at the end. But he does. We've been saying all podcast long. He does decide of his own volition that he is not going to be the best person that he could be, but he is kind of content with that to a degree. He is living probably, according to him, the best life he could be. And that's an interesting thing to extrapolate into the real world. I don't think the answer or what the Coens are trying to say is be like Llewyn Davis. 100% at least. I don't think they're trying to tell you, if life gives you lemons, suck it up. I think they're trying to say, whatever you've got, it's something special. And no matter what you do with it, if you overcome the obstacles in your life, that you can enjoy it, have some meaning, and I think that's why a lot of people were saying, I actually saw someone say that because of Llewyn Davis, they were able to have like a kind of a paradigm shift on battling their own depression. And if it's that strong, then there must be something to it.
Mm-hmm. This is a powerful movie. I actually started watching it last night, and my dad walked through, and he's just about to go to bed. And he likes folk music, so he kind of paused during the initial scene where Llewyn is singing in the Gaslight Cafe. And then he remained standing and just watched for like the next 10, 15 minutes. And then he kind of hesitated and sat down and watched the entire rest of the movie with me.
Wow.
Yeah. Despite planning to go to bed moments before.
Yeah.
Because it's so good. I hate to do this, but I think it was funny, so I'm gonna lean away from thematic stuff for a moment. The character of Bud Grossman is related to another character named Stan Grossman, who appears in Fargo, and who's sort of a publishing producer, I believe. Now, that in itself is kind of a fun little Easter egg, but it gets better. Stan Grossman also appears in the movie Little Miss Sunshine. The writers of that actually got permissions from the Coens to do so, and in that movie, he's played by Bryan Cranston.
Whoa.
And
oh, yeah.
Both Bud Grossman and Stan Grossman are related to Les Grossman, Tom Cruise's character in Tropic Thunder.
No way.
I'm serious. So it's just bizarre to process that Inside Llewyn Davis and Tropic Thunder take place in the same universe.
That's unbelievable. That's so cool. I was watching the film, and I thought, Grossman, where do I know that? Oh, Les Grossman, who's that? Oh, yeah, this guy from Tropic Thunder.
It is not a coincidence.
What is it with, like, writers just deciding to name their corporate villains Grossman? But I guess it's not coincidence. They just, that's crazy. That's unbelievable.
Bud and Les Grossman even look alike, now that I'm realizing it.
They have the same hair. Wow.
Awesome. All right. Ethan, I think I'm going to go ahead and ask you the big question.
Okay.
What is your favorite scene in Inside Llewyn Davis?
I would actually like to remind us to touch on one point later on, the music. And
Sure.
Because of the music, I'm able to nail down one of my favorite scenes, which is... I almost feel bad saying this is my favorite scene because it's kind of just a fun scene. It has some plot relevance, but it is not the deepest scene in the film, which, like I said, the theme is my favorite part of this, the thematic depth. But I love the scene where they're recording that song about John F. Kennedy shooting them off into rocket ships into space. That scene is... The music is great. I loved it so much. But it is so funny. The song is pretty funny. But Adam Driver in that scene, that is the funniest part of the film to me. Where he just starts like... They're practicing the song, and he's just like making noises off to the side. And then they start singing the song. And all he is there to do is just be like, outer space, like just in the background of the song. It is so hilarious, but it is as well probably even my favorite song in the film. It was just, it also makes me think, the Coens are aware they're not like Denis Villeneuve, where they'll beat you down for 2.5 hours. Even if they have an hour 45-minute film, they're gonna fill it with some levity because they're just hilarious, and I really appreciated that. What about you, Aidan?
Your comment about "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou"? This movie being "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou's" evil twin definitely applies there because both of these movies just have sort of fun musical scenes tossed in.
Yeah.
The executive music producer on both of these films was T-Bone Burnett, who's sort of this expert on kind of early American folk music. And you can definitely tell. The soundtracks of both absolutely bang. And even that one song that Llewyn sings with his partner, Mike. Well, first off, one of the most interesting things about this movie is that all of the singing and playing is authentically done by the actors.
Really?
Which is like...
I wondered.
It is like unheard of to do that in a major movie, especially with actors this big. I mean, obviously someone like, Justin Timberlake can already sing. That's how he made his career. But like Oscar Isaac had no formal singing training before this movie or, guitar training. And they trained him until he authentically seemed like a good musician. That is amazing. And it really comes across. Also, one interesting aspect, if you're a fan of Mumford & Sons, the lead singer, I can't remember his name. It's like, it's something Mumford, does the voice of Llewyn's old partner, Mike. So that one song, If I Had Wings, is Oscar Isaac and Mumford singing together.
That's very cool. I'm looking up T-Bone Burnett's filmography right now. He is also the composer on True Detective, which has a very, pretty folky soundtrack. He did Walk the Line, a film called Across the Universe. I've never heard of that, but I would assume it's about the Beatles, and a film called Great Balls of Fire. So I guess he is your go-to folk composer for cinema.
He was also a guitarist in Bob Dylan's band during the 1970s. Wow.
Really?
Yeah. So he looks like he's got some personal experience with the sort of world that this film takes place in. That's awesome.
Yeah. All right, Aidan, what is your favorite scene of the film, or aspect, or whatever you want?
Favorite scene? Oh, geez. It's really tough to pick one. This is one of those movies where the pacing, it's not quite as much in separate scenes as some other movies. It's just sort of one long, languid flow. I really, really like the scene where he goes to the... Is it Gorman's? I knew the name earlier. He goes to his friend's house for dinner, and they've got other friends there. And that scene is simultaneously one of the funniest and dramatically heftiest scenes in the entire movie.
I almost couldn't watch it.
Oh, man. Just just the like pain on his face as she starts singing along, and he freaks out is horrible. And then it's immediately followed up with what I think is maybe the funniest line in the movie, where she rushes out holding the cat and screaming, "This is not our cat! It's not even male! Where's its scrotum, Llewyn? Where's his scrotum?"
That was so funny.
That's Coen. That's Pete Coen's right there.
Absolutely.
It doesn't even necessarily have that much plot relevance, but oh man. And what's his name Green and what's her name Fung introducing their baby too is hysterical.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think it's a great little scene, and that's sort of a scene where the Coens feel free to be a little more of their casual. I'm not going to say mean-spirited, but a little more like darkly comedic selves, as we are hit with this small group of characters, which is, you know, his hosts and their friends, who are clearly very pretentiously stupid. Yeah. And the Coens just have a blast making fun of them. And then, you know, obviously you've got the scene at the dinner table, which is just so heartbreaking to watch. And Oscar Isaac's performance is fantastic. It just carries that so well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot to unpack about that scene. I just think it's extraordinarily entertaining. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like... it was so awkward all the way through in terms, of... that scene really had it all. But in terms of comedy and drama, where at first he's trying to talk to these people, and he's just like, you remember, like, Miss Diamond or something? And they just stare at him and, like, make him talk for 60 seconds. And I'm like, what is wrong with these people? Who are they? Who ever invited them to a social gathering ever? But then later it turns into, this part where it's like, you see just, he's very exposed in that moment. And once Oscar Isaac's vein starts popping out in the middle of his forehead, you know that he's going for a great scene.
Yeah.
I would love to spend a little time talking about the music. This film opens with a song, and I heard it, and I was like, whew. As soon as this ends, I am finding that on Spotify and putting it in my playlist. And the film kept going on, and I was like, oh my gosh, every single song in this film is so good. I'm just going to download the soundtrack. And yes, Oh Brother Where Art Thou, unbelievable soundtrack. Already have that one downloaded. The Soggy Bottom Boys cover of Man of Constant Sorrow is one of maybe the greatest song ever created in a fictional universe. But listening to, these folksy old early American history music is very rich. Music is one of the most evocative forms of art, and it's very great when it's one of my favorite things, in fact, when an art form will expand from their immediate medium and add other forms of art. And it really adds depth to this film. The most emotional times that Llewyn ever is when he is making music. They're really the moments that he lets his guard down and you can kind of see into his soul. So aside from just being so amazing to listen to, it's a very necessary aspect to this film.
Absolutely. This movie would not be nearly as good without the soundtrack. And it just pulls off all these things that, it shouldn't be able to do. We've already mentioned how it takes actors who are not professional singers, except Justin Timberlake, and has them give exceptional singing performances. They do great. You know, it fits the tone very well. I think every song except for Please Mr. Kennedy has sort of this melancholy feel that beautifully complements, you know, the wintry, depressed feel of the movie. And it just bangs, you know? It's fun to listen to.
All right, Aidan, I've got to ask you a pretty tough question.
Here we go.
Do you have a least favorite aspect of this film?
Okay. Well, this time, I'm not sure I can just say Justin Timberlake, because A, we already did that for the Social Network episode, and it's boring, and B, he's not long enough in this movie to really bother me, and I legitimately think he gives an okay performance, you know?
I concur.
I think he's better than in the Social Network.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, because it shows that the Coens were able to get a better performance out of him than OCD David Fincher.
Maybe it's because he had 2 years to grow as an actor.
That may honestly be it. 2 years of bad movies to make in between and just develop. Okay, actual least favorite aspect. Oh, man. I think a few of the characters besides Llewyn, so it is a Llewyn-centric movie, so I can excuse it, but I do think a few of them are just a little too thinly developed. I think Jean in particular, who you could make a pretty good argument is the second most important character after Llewyn. I think she just is not a fantastically written character. Her rants are fun to listen to, but at a certain point she just becomes sort of shrill, you know? And her constant yelling just kind of gets old. I don't know. I don't have a problem with the actress. Carey Mulligan does it well. But I think she's a thin character. And I think the other characters are also thin. The movie worked in some ambient music about halfway through in the whole like road trip scene, which was fine. You know, I like ambient music in most movies. It did feel a little off, you know, compared to the soundtrack of the rest of the movie.
Yes. Yeah.
Johnny Five is an interesting character. This is very, very much a nitpick, but the audio mixing on Johnny Five was so low that I could only understand half of what he said. And the first time I watched it, it took me like a few sentences to process that he was reading poetry in that one part.
Yeah,
I thought he was saying random things. Yeah, I think that's about it for things I dislike. There are a few shots, I guess, that can look a little bit cheap. For the most part, it's very good at remaining fairly immersive. And, you know, it makes sense. It's not a movie where you need, like, big, wide shots or big establishing shots because it's so character-centric. But at times, the sets looked more sound-stagey and less realistic than I would have liked. I'm thinking in particular of that one shot. Might be, like, one of the only wide shots in the movie, where after Llewyn's been beat up and he's just kind of leaning against the side of the alleyway and the guy who beat him up is getting into the taxi and there's just this big shot of this entire street by the Gaslight Cafe covered in garbage. And I looked at it and I thought, that is a set. That is not a real building, and I can tell, and that's a problem. But honestly, other than those few nitpicks, which are just extremely minor flaws within the filmmaking itself, I'd say, I love this movie. I think it's fantastically scripted, fantastically acted. It has a very clear vision in mind, and I think it just succeeds at it admirably.
Okay.
Well, how about you, Ethan? What is your least favorite aspect of Inside Llewyn Davis?
So, this is a little weird, because you could actually end up convincing me that this is one of my favorite aspects.
Ooh.
But the narrative structure is a little wacky, and you could make an argument that it is thematic, but there was kind of no inciting action, which I feel like would make it stronger. Where all of a sudden, because it is kind of an epic, you know, it's a journey. He goes on this whole journey.
It's like the Odyssey, yeah.
Yeah. And, there's really no journey that just kind of happens, and if there is, it's pretty lame. However, you could argue that it's just like, this is just a moment in his life, and it's cyclical, and it's, it's not like this huge experience if this is just what's happening over and over again. I don't know. You could. I'm not at a point where I'm ready to say that yet. The other thing is, I forget who invented this concept. Well, not invented, but really put it to work. But there is kind of this rule of thumb in cinema that you want to connect your scenes with the words so and but rather than and. For example, one thing happens to a character, so we go to the next scene. But this happens, so we go to the next scene. Rather than this happens to a character, and this happens to a character, and we go to this scene, and then this happens.
Gotcha.
And this film was very fluid in moving from scene to scene. But it did not really seem like any individual scene had an impact on the next. However, I'm kind of okay with that. That is kind of a convention of this line of story. If you look at the Odyssey, which is, I bring that up because that's what O Brother was based off of, you have inciting action, which is the so throughout the whole narrative, but it's never like Ulysses fights the Cyclops, so he's in this predicament next. It's just he fights the Cyclops, and then he finds the sirens, and then they're in Troy, and which is maybe originally a fault of the genre, but that's okay to exploit if you're making a genre piece. I just don't know if that's a strong enough explanation.
Yeah, so the story structure is definitely unconventional, and I think you really have a good point there with the there is no inciting incident type thing. So, as you said, this is heavily inspired by the Odyssey. The Odyssey has influenced a lot of the Coen's work. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? Maybe more explicitly than their other movies, but pretty much all of their movies take inspiration from it. In the Odyssey, there is still inciting action. Odysseus wants to get home to his wife.
Exactly.
That's the driving force behind the story. Inside Llewyn Davis, he just sort of wanders around for a few days and is miserable. However, what's interesting is the other main source that this movie takes some inspiration from, and I actually wasn't familiar with this, but my dad encouraged me to read up on it, so I read up on it some last night, was a novel by James Joyce called Ulysses. Ulysses, of course, is the Latin form of the name Odysseus, and
Right.
Ulysses is basically this Irish modernist novel that was serialized in the 20s, and it follows a whole bunch of characters who sort of know each other in one day in Dublin, and none of them really accomplishes anything. They just sort of bounce off each other and interact with each other and have extremely small character arcs without really any inciting actions in sort of this big, messy epic of everyday life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Inside Llewyn Davis, I'd say, is sort of like that, where you don't really have an inciting action. This character who is just kind of aimless goes, all right, I got to do something, and kind of sets out without a plan, really. And I don't know, it's definitely not a conventional story structure, but I think it works. I think it works for the character who is completely bored and doesn't know what he's doing. He has nowhere to go. He spends a couple days wandering around, doesn't accomplish anything, comes back, and it's implied that he will repeat the process or something like it pretty soon. So I will agree that it's unconventional and it's got some holes in it, but I personally think it works for the film.
Yeah. I will admit that I probably enjoy when a film hits Blake Snyder's beat sheet pretty exactly more than I ought to. But this is if ever there was a film that should break away from that, it does it well in this. And I don't know if I'd say anymore that that's a nitpick. It's a decision I can understand, and I can agree with either way.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, Ethan, I think we're about running out of steam.
Sounds like it.
It has been an absolute pleasure discussing this movie with you. I'm glad you enjoyed watching it overall. And I'm looking forward to what we have in store next week.
Absolutely. I very much enjoyed this discussion. I was actually able to grow a new appreciation of this film through discussing our ideas together.
All right.
Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of Armchair Critics. If you have any thoughts, feedback, or any other suggestions, you can email us at armchaircriticspodcast@gmail.com or visit us on Twitter at criticsarmchair or on Instagram at armchaircritics. We hope to see you next week, in which we are going to be covering Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit by popular demand. And we hope to see you then. Thank you guys for listening all the way through.